Hi, I'm Dr. Natalie Pearson, and I'm here to introduce you to Understanding Southeast Asia. I am the Curriculum Coordinator at the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre, and I'm joined today by Professor Adrian Vickers, who's going to introduce us to this unit. Adrian, could you start by telling us what your role is at the University of Sydney?
So I'm the Director of Asian Studies, and I oversee all of the Asian Studies offerings, which includes ASNS2665, Introduction to Southeast Asia. And one of the things that we do at the university is to really try to give you an understanding of Asia as a whole, but then to go into the different parts of Asia, and in this case, to try to get people into the broad context of Southeast Asia, which is a very complex topic.
Let's unpack that. What is this region that we're talking about? What is Southeast Asia?
Southeast Asia is the region south of China and east of India, and it's known as the crossroads of Asia. So it's a very complex region, and it's usually talked about in two parts. So the northern part is known as mainland Southeast Asia, and it takes in Myanmar and Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam and Laos. And then there's island Southeast Asia, which includes Malaysia, although Malaysia is actually joined to the mainland. And then there's an island part of Malaysia, but then Brunei and Indonesia is the largest country in Southeast Asia, and then the Philippines, Singapore, and then also there's Timor-Leste. So Southeast Asia more or less coincides with the region called ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, except that Timor-Leste is not yet a member of ASEAN.
So given that it's one of the most diverse regions in the world, and we're sort of framing it in terms of where it sits in relation to India and China and Australia, what do these countries have in common?
They've got a very long history, and that history has been one that's linked through trade, and historians have looked at going back to the 5th, 6th century in the Common Era, although there's evidence that it's much earlier, that the fact that spices from Southeast Asia were traded through the rest of the world, and people came from China, India and Arabia and traded spices to Europe and throughout the world. So there's this long history of trade connections between the different countries. And also then they've got very long and very deep cultural roots. So some of that is about religion and religious connections. If you think about mainland Southeast Asia, then it's predominantly one form of Buddhism. And island Southeast Asia, there are all of these links through Islam, but then older links through Buddhism and Hinduism as well. But then there are indigenous cultural elements that are shared between all of these different countries. So even though we're talking about hundreds, literally hundreds of different languages and even different language families and lots of different traditions, you can see it in different types of food and costumes and other elements of heritage, but still there are all these common links that join Southeast Asia together.
Why have academics been so engaged in very complex debates about this region?
Well, even defining the region is tricky. So as I've already said, there are two main parts of the region, and the term Southeast Asia is relatively new. So it developed in the middle of the 20th century. It came out of World War II. It was a regional command, the Southeast Asia Command, and it was used as a term of convenience, but in fact there are indigenous terms that also define the region. So one of those is the reference to it being the lands below the winds, and another is the term Nusantara, which is in Indonesian and Malay. It refers to the archipelago. And so scholars have debated whether how much we should make of all the links and whether we should just talk about talk about it in terms of individual countries, but I think it's more important to look at Southeast Asia as a whole.
Great, which is exactly what we're going to be doing in this unit.
Indeed, yes.
So tell us about the geopolitical significance of Southeast Asia.
So Southeast Asia is strategic. There's no doubt about it. If you think about where it is, as I said, between India and China, then part of it being a crossroads and the crossroads of trade is not just the ancient spice trade, but even modern trade. So something like 2/3 of the world's oil passes through the Straits of Malacca, which go between Malaysia and Indonesia and where Singapore is located. And in terms of current politics, there's things like disputes over the South China Seas and the strategic and resource implications of that. And then if we go back further to the 1960s, 1970s, of course you had the Vietnam War or the Indochina War, and that was another strategically important element of Southeast Asian history. But then you also think about the size of the population. So Indonesia is the 4th largest country in the world. It's more than 250 million people packed onto some very small islands.
Right.
And you think about the size of those populations and the importance of the economies, that all means that this is crucial to a whole lot of developments in the world.
So you've just talked to us about the geopolitical significance of Southeast Asia, and we've touched on the demographics and the linguistic diversity of Southeast Asia, this idea that it's a historical construct in a way. What are some of the other issues we should be thinking about when we're thinking about Southeast Asia?
So one of the things that's, I guess, upmost in current attention is the ecology. And so there are a lot of environmental issues. So some of those are just long-term issues that Indonesia and the Philippines in particular are on what's called the Ring of Fire, the chain of seismic activity. So there are lots of volcanoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, that's been important. But in terms of the size of the population of Southeast Asia, that has had major environmental impacts. So people talk a lot about the cutting down of the rainforests in the Amazon, but the destruction of Southeast Asian rainforests has been equally important. So the island of Borneo, which is actually 3 countries, Brunei, Malaysia and Indonesia, that has had massive deforestation in recent years, and a lot of those forests have been replaced by palm oil, and so there's a lot of politics around the palm oil development and the sale of palm oil, and that's one of the things that we'll be looking at later in the unit of study as well. And there are things like the Mekong River, one of the world's major rivers, which is also now facing an environmental crisis, partly through drought, but also partly through the damming of the river. There's major dams in China and in Laos that are having significant impacts on Vietnam and Cambodia. So those kinds of things are important. Overfishing, that a lot of the fish stocks of Southeast Asia are now being heavily depleted.
And of course some of those issues, for example, this issue of illegal fishing, bring in human rights issues such as slavery at sea.
Yeah, it's very difficult to separate any of them. So the issue that you raised is really important, but also things like palm oil. So research that's been done on palm oil reveals that has major impacts for labour relations, because a whole lot of people are brought in as cheap contract labour in palm oil areas, and they're massively exploited. So there are lots and lots of significant labour issues, significant socio-economic or social justice issues that come out of things related to the environment.
And surely with the loss of biodiversity, just going on this palm oil example, there would certainly be consequences for food security in the region as well, I expect.
Yes, yeah, that with palm oil we're seeing a lot of monocropping, And so when you get then things like natural disasters or droughts, then that also means that at certain points the availability of food and the ability to feed those massive populations come into question. So most of the region is based on rice. Rice farming is fundamental to the region, but then a number of countries now are facing rice shortages, and the traditional major producers of rice like Thailand are also then having flow-on effects from some of the other environmental problems.
I think this is a great introduction to the unit, and what I'd like to ask you to do now is to tell us how this unit is structured.
Okay, so one of the things that we've tried to do is to give a sense of this as an area studies unit, that is something that's looked at through the lens of different disciplines. Okay. And so the first part of the unit will look at disciplinary perspectives on the region, how history, politics, sociology have come to shape our understanding of the region. And then we'll look at a number of key themes. So resources, inequality and discrimination, those kinds of issues will be part of the second part of this unit of study.
Given how many people live in Southeast Asia, this question might seem to answer itself, but why are Facebook and social media so prevalent in Southeast Asia?
It's amazing how that's actually developed in the last few decades, that Southeast Asia has previously struggled with communication, that in the days when we were dependent on telephone wires, it was very difficult to actually connect up with people. And then suddenly with the development of social media, there are all these amazing ways to suddenly make instant contact. And in general, everybody in Southeast Asia has embraced that. It fits in with different Southeast Asian cultures. And it's partly that thing of having extensive individual networks that you can mobilise really quickly. So most of my Indonesian Facebook friends would already have filled up their quota of 5,000 Facebook friends. That's really typical. And then the other thing is WhatsApp. WhatsApp is an amazing device, and everybody uses WhatsApp as the most immediate way to communicate. And it's quite amazing because you can get the WhatsApp address of a cabinet minister or somebody, and once you've got that, then that cabinet minister will reply to your messages, and it's really easy to meet people. There's quite an amazing openness in Southeast Asian communications that's been facilitated by the development of social media.
Which is fabulous for researchers, but of course there are consequences for fake news and hoaxes and that sort of potential spread of hate speech.
Oh, it's a really complex issue, and yeah, that in some ways things like rumours and suspicion about what's going on, people are always suspicious of government, have always been there, but now they've been magnified by social media. So there's lots of complex issues to do with politics, society, ethnicity, different kinds of crises and so on that social media is enmeshed with.
What are the benefits of studying Southeast Asia?
The benefits are immense. So it depends. Our students actually often are people with some kind of connection to Southeast Asia, whether it's just people who've been there on holidays, the holiday to Bali or Thailand and want to know more, or we have a lot of students who have some kind of Southeast Asian heritage, but maybe they know about one part of Southeast Asia and they want to get the wider picture of the region. So there's lots of personal interests that people have in terms of just the richness of Southeast Asia. But in terms of employability and things like that, it's really, really important. So if you think that at any one time there would be something like 30,000 Australians working in Singapore, that gives you a sense of the scale of people's involvement in the region as somewhere where you might live temporarily for, if you're a teacher, if you're involved in any kind of business, certainly people who go and work for government, having a knowledge of Southeast Asia and perhaps a Southeast Asian language like Indonesian, that's really, really important, and different government agencies look at that. But all of the major legal firms, the accounting firms, finance, all of those are areas where Southeast Asia is really important, and so for anybody's future employment prospects, it's absolutely vital.
And with 11 countries, there's almost an unlimited amount of places to visit and to learn about. So thank you for introducing us to Understanding Southeast Asia.
Thank you.